Chapter 11. The Tower Signaler. Nancy, Bess, and George pulled chairs close to Mr. Peter Judd so they would not miss one word of the story he was about to tell. Suddenly Nancy jumped up and commanded, "Wait!" She turned and dashed toward the front door, calling as she went, "Girls, run out the back way and stop that man!" Mr. Judd was amazed. He did not know what Nancy meant, but he hurried to a window and looked outside. He was just in time to see Nancy take off full speed after a man who was fleeing down the embankment toward the dock. Before she could reach him, the man jumped into a motorboat tied alongside the girls' rented runabout and roared off. Nancy came to a full stop on the dock. It would be useless to try to pursue the man. He had too much of a head start. Bess and George ran up to her. "Who was he?" Bess asked. "Why were you chasing him?" The young sleuth explained that as Mr. Judd was about to start his story, she had seen the top of the head of an eavesdropper just outside the window. "I got a better look at him as he jumped into his boat. I think he's the man who followed me in River Heights, the one who was following George here in Deep River. He's the man I said looked familiar." "He seems determined to find out what we're doing," Bess remarked. "I'll say he is," George agreed. "So far as I'm concerned, he's definitely an enemy." "And maybe he's one of the kidnappers," Bess suggested. "Why don't we follow him? He might lead us to Mr. Wheeler." George scoffed at this idea. "That's exactly what he wouldn't do," she said, laughing. "Anyhow, we wouldn't be able to overtake him now." Nancy nodded. "Let's go back and hear Mr. Judd's story," she suggested. Inside the cottage once more, she described the eavesdropper and their past encounters with him. "Have you any idea who he might be?" Mr. Judd shook his head, and Nancy begged him to tell the story which had been interrupted. "While I was on a train running direct from New York City to Deep River some 15 years ago," he began, "I specially noted 3 passengers in one of the cars. A man, a woman, and a very pretty little girl between 2 and 3 years old. When I had some free time, I stopped to talk to her. She said her name was Jonie, and she was going to stay with her other granny." Nancy, Bess, and George listened intently. This was indeed interesting. "Joanie made a remark that I have never forgotten. She said her granddaddy and grandmommy she was with were going far away to tell people about God." "Missionaries?" Bess queried. "I suppose so," said Mr. Judd. "Well, the little girl and her parents got off in Deep River, and I never saw any of them again. Months later, when I heard about Mrs. Horton and her grown-up granddaughter named Jonie, I remembered about those folks on the train. I kept thinking about that grown-up girl getting all the money, and I thought I ought to tell Mr. Wheeler the story." George blurted out, "You told this to Mr. Wheeler all that time ago, and he didn't do anything about it?" "As I said before, he just laughed at me. I felt kind of silly and never mentioned the story again to anyone. Now, maybe, Mr. Wheeler has changed his mind and wants to know about it in more detail." "No doubt," Nancy agreed. "Can you give us the details?" "The little girl had big blue eyes and blonde curls." Nancy excitedly opened her purse and took out the picture of young Joanie Horton at the age of 2. "Is this the child?" she asked. It was now Mr. Judd's turn to look astounded. "It certainly looks like her," the ex-conductor said. "Of course, it was a long time ago, but this is just about the way I remember little Joanie." Mr. Judd asked Nancy to explain her connection with the Horton family. "Actually, it's my father's case," she replied, knowing that it might be unwise to reveal her part in the investigation. "I expect my dad to come to Deep River in a little while. He'll probably come to call on you very soon." This evasive answer seemed to satisfy Mr. Judd, and before he had a chance to say anything more, Nancy arose, thanked him and said the girls must leave. "I certainly hope they find Mr. Wheeler soon," Mr. Judd called, as his visitors went toward the dock. When the girls were seated in the runabout, Nancy's face wore a broad grin. "This is the best clue yet," she exclaimed. "It's simply marvelous," said Bess. "How are you going to develop it?" Nancy said she thought it might be a good idea to do a little sleuthing among the shopkeepers in town. There may be some who were here 15 years ago, and perhaps could tell us if any articles for a small child were sent out to the Horton home. Nancy suggested that the girls divide up the shopping area and make separate calls on the storekeepers. This bit of delving took until the latter part of the afternoon. They had about given up hope of any further clue until Nancy entered a small toy store. It was run by an elderly man and woman. After learning that the couple had been in town for over 30 years, Nancy asked her question. The man and woman looked at each other, then smiled. Finally, the woman said, "I remember something about a child's gift very well. The most beautiful doll and carriage we have ever sold were ordered over the telephone at Christmas time and delivered to the Horton home." "Did the person who delivered it see a little girl there?" Nancy asked. "No, our messenger saw no one. I remember clearly how he reported to us that a check and a note had been left on the Horton porch with instructions for him to leave the toys there." The man shopkeeper, curious, asked Nancy why she had made her inquiry. As nonchalantly as possible, Nancy answered, "My father is interested in the Horton family. My friends and I came up here on a vacation, and he asked me to find out what I could about them." "I see," said the man. "Can't tell you anything more." He turned and walked into a back room. At the same time, a boy came in through the front door, and the woman went to wait on him. The girls left. "This is our day for good luck," said Bess. "Maybe the Moonstone is bringing it." Nancy laughed, but agreed that they had picked up 2 valuable clues. "Right now I have so many trails to follow, I don't know which to take. The one I'd like most to pursue would be the opportunity of talking to Jody Armstrong." "Then why don't you?" said George. "She's probably home by now." "No," said Nancy. "If I seem like a friendship pusher, the Armstrongs may become suspicious and not let me see Jody at all." "You're right," said Bess. "Anyhow, don't forget, the boys are coming today. I want to shampoo my hair before they get here. It's a sight after all our trekking around and the wind blowing it in that boat." The girls took a taxi to the motel. As soon as they reached it, Nancy went to the telephone. She called police headquarters and asked if there was any news of her stolen car. "Not a trace," said the officer on duty. "I'm sorry, Miss Drew. We're still working hard trying to find it." Nancy next asked whether Mr. Wheeler had been found. Again, the answer was no. Nancy hung up. In spite of this disappointment and worry over the whereabouts of the injured lawyer, the day's new clues spurred Nancy on. She felt too excited to go to her room to rest or start dressing. "I think I'll get the binoculars and take another look at that castle," she decided. She got the glasses and went out to the terrace. As she trained the binoculars on the distant building, the tower of the castle came into sharp focus. Nancy gasped. A man, bewhiskered and unkempt, stood on the roof of the tower. He, too, held glasses to his eyes. They were trained directly on the motel, and Nancy... Instantly, Nancy dodged behind a tree. "I hope he didn't see me." Though out of sight, she continued to focus her own binoculars on him. The man put down his binoculars and began to make strange motions with his hands. Nancy watched him intently. She asked herself, "Has that man gone crazy? Or is he trying to signal someone?" End of chapter 11.